Hey folks, before we start today's show, I wanted to let you know about the KTCO Holiday Shop. Now through December 31st, 2018, I and 12 other artists are offering photographs, letterpress prints, photo books, calendars, and more. If you're looking for the perfect gift for the art lover in your life, or perhaps if you've been interested in starting an art collection of your own, this is a great place to look. And not only will your purchase directly support the artist you're buying from, but it will also help support the show. So, this month, be sure to check out the KTCO Holiday Shop at keepthechannelopen.com/holiday shop. That's keepthechannelopen.com/holiday shop. And now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 77. Today's guest is Brandon Thibodeaux. Hey folks, today's guest is photographer Brandon Thibodeaux. Brandon Thibodeaux is a photographer based in Dallas, Texas, who creates portraits in the documentary tradition. In addition to his assignment work and creative commissions, he explores life in the American South. He's also a guest instructor with the Santa Fe Photographic and Main Media workshops. His work is included in the High Museum of Art, the Museum of Photographic Arts, the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, and various private collections. I met Brandon at this year's Medium Festival of Photography, where he presented his project In That Land of Perfect Day, in which he documents daily life in several majority African-American communities in the Mississippi Delta, looking at faith, identity, and perseverance. Writing for PDN, Connor Risch says, In That Land of Perfect Day interweaves formal portraits and landscapes and candid and metaphorical photographs Thibodeaux made over 8 years in a 40-square-mile area of the Mississippi Delta, in towns with populations as small as 250 and as large as 10,000. We see Thibodeaux's subjects pausing at work, socializing, praying, enjoying a visit to the ice cream truck. There's a young girl dressed as an angel, a child sleeping next to a kitten, a man standing on his porch shirtless, flexing for the camera. There are images of religious and racial symbols, a headless snake, and a framed picture of President Barack Obama on a living room side table. Thibodeaux's texts touch on the history of the region and share personal stories of his experiences making the images. And in Port magazine, Laura Francis wrote, In That Land of Perfect Day possesses the quiet, self-contained dignity of a genuine connection wrought between photographer and subject. This mutual respect is indicated in how often Thibodeaux shoots his subjects looking directly into the camera, demanding to be seen, to be reckoned with, a portrait of a region caught between optimism and skepticism. At the Medium Festival, Brandon talked about the relationships he made over the course of visiting these communities again and again, over the course of almost a decade, and more than anything else, it was that connection that drew me in. I know that it is a necessarily fraught topic, the idea of a white photographer coming into a community of color to tell their stories, and it's fraught for a lot of good reasons. The history of photography, whether you're talking about art or documentary photography, it's a history of colonialism and appropriation and problems of representation and of gatekeeping, and not just on the side of the photographer, but also on the side of the consumer, the audience. So all of this was on my mind as I listened to Brandon give his presentation and talk about these people with whom he'd created these relationships and these images. And there is, I think, something compelling about this story, about the idea of a real relationship being made across many kinds of difference. So I wanted to talk to him about this, and we did. And I think it was an interesting and fruitful conversation, and I'm happy to be sharing it with you today. Now, something we touched on briefly in our conversation is that in addition to being a freelancer and a documentarian, Brandon also gives workshops. Coming up in February 2019, Brandon will be giving a workshop via the Medium Festival here in San Diego. It's a 4-day workshop called Turning Work into Work, Bringing Personal Vision to the Marketplace. And it focuses on the relationship between personal work and work for hire. That's going to be from Thursday, February 28th through Sunday, March 3rd, 2019. And I put a link in the show notes, so do check that out. Okay, so let's get started then. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPhoto to live tweet the episode. And now here's my conversation with Brandon Thibodeaux.
How was your time with Medium? Did you enjoy this one?
I always enjoy Medium. And this one was interesting, especially because, he changes it up a little bit every year, Scott does. Mm-hmm. And so this year was the first year they did the trip to Tijuana, which, I've lived in San Diego for like 13 years now. Uh-huh. And I've never been to the only time I've ever been to Mexico is like on a layover in like Mexico City airport. Other than that, it's kind of funny because, it's really, really close, but psychologically it feels farther away than it is, if that makes sense. But yeah, it was really great. And I got to see some really good stuff, at the places that we went in Tijuana. And, I don't know. I really enjoy getting to spend time with other artists,
Yeah, sure.
How about yourself? Was it?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of always been my take on festivals is that I think I've run through the gamut when I was really pushing this project, starting in like 2010, 2011, running through all the domestic photo festivals. And, the big takeaway was building that sense of community and the dialogue that comes from it that inevitably would kind of energize me for wherever I was headed next with my work. And, I can talk about it a little bit later too, but which was kind of, I think the topic I was going to touch upon, but, the notion as a editorial freelancer, corporate freelancer, it can be very much like an island, in terms of creative dialogue. And, the goal is to always, kind of create an archipelago of sorts to bounce ideas off of one another. And, so I really enjoy the times at the festivals to see what other folks are working on and share those stories of like pitfalls and triumphs. And, so that's rewarding.
I thought this year's festival was quite good. And, I'm always very impressed with, the lectures. And I thought this year, they were quite good, as they always are. And for me, I always just, this show really was born out of the kinds of conversations that I get to have just hanging around in the lobby in between sessions.
Sure.
So yeah, it really has always meant a lot to me that it's so close for me because I live in San Diego and then, but then, speaking of those lectures, I really enjoyed yours quite a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because your work, you were just talking about community and how that's important, and your work certainly is very much about community as well. It's something that I find very interesting, and I hope you don't mind the sort of the first question that I wanted to ask you is kind of, I don't know, it may be a kind of banal question, but I hope it'll go somewhere. And that's just, where are you from yourself?
Actually from right where I'm sitting now. I grew up in Southeast Texas, and I was born in a town called Port Arthur, Texas, and raised in a town just slightly north of there, called Beaumont, Texas. So right on the Louisiana line, along the Gulf Coast. Very, very much like a blue collar oil town. Lots of refineries and, fishing, and that's the types of things. If you were a male and you grew up here, it was, chances where you would walk into a refinery and retire there 50 years later. And somehow I broke out and made my way to Dallas about 15 years ago. And I just moved to Houston, closer to home, just about an hour from my hometown. We moved a month ago. So kind of getting back into the roots in a way.
Yeah. I guess the reason that I'm asking is just because, one of the things that I was thinking a lot about with your work is how the community that you're photographing in this series, in that Land of Perfect Day, is not a place that you yourself are from, but it is a place that has very clearly become important to you and become a part of your life. over the course of your work there. But I'm always very interested, when people are photographing communities that they are not part of, or at least not part of initially, I'm always kind of curious, like sort of how that comes about,
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that goes back to the question of like, photographically, who belongs where, right? And it's given the nature of my work in terms of sort of looking at what the American South is today, and then race relations. That's obviously been a big spotlight for me in the past few years in terms of validity of authorship and who's supposed to say what, right? So yeah, I mean, how could I say it? Looking back, am I like the perfect narrator for this tale? Being who I am and coming from a different region, who's to say? But the only reason that I was able to tell what I'm telling is, people have allowed me to, right? And, I've come across, the questions of the validity of my authorship on the subject, given that ethnicity. And that raises its own sort of series of questions about the people I stay with and photograph, who are, older men that are well beyond being able to decipher who to trust and who to confide in and share their families with. The building of this work over 9, almost 10 years now has been this sort of, balance and mutual trust, and finding common ground.
Well, yeah, I think that one of the things that's really apparent, not just from the stories that you told in your presentation at Medium, but also from the photographs themselves, is that you do have a certain intimacy with the people that you're photographing. At least like, some of the photographs, and this is something that other people have noted as well when they're writing about your work, that some of the photographs, especially the ones that are sort of chronologically earlier, that the people in your photographs may have a certain sort of guardedness in their face, but that over time, as you continue to sort of deepen these relationships, that that is apparent in the photographs, that there is a relationship between you and the people that you're photographing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. I think that comes from spending so much time. I mean, what started out as a sort of series of serendipitous encounters, led from a bicycle ride from, township to township, relying on the generosity and openness of strangers to, sharing birthdays with folks or Christmases or, some of the families I'd stay with, if the parents needed to sleep in the morning, I'm the one that gets the kids dressed and packs their backpacks and drives them to school. So there's a whole other level of intimacy that one might not expect to have in sort of my working world, where my job is to make friends with people. I always say that, in being a freelance, photographer for newspapers and such, it's like, my job isn't necessarily, just to make nicely composed images. It's really finding common ground and making people feel comfortable, very quickly. And that can be as surface as, as the situation allows, or it can be as deep, but being able to really live and grow with people over the course of nearly a decade, certainly changed the dynamics of, like, say, my portraiture or opportunities to photograph in communities where, people will oftentimes suggest to me, hey, we're going to go do this, or, hey, it's my cousin's birthday tomorrow. Do you want to come to the party? Or we're going to go to church in the morning. Do you want to come? There's this whole other sort of level of understanding and sort of blending in with the natural ebb and flow of the common day. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I don't know, one of the things for me is just, I have And I don't know if this is, I'm not sure what this necessarily says about me or the community that I live in or the communities that I grew up in. Because, you know, like I'm personally from a fairly small town myself. I think that the town that I grew up in is sort of, at least population wise, a similar size to the town of Mount Bayou that is sort of the main place where you're photographing. But I just have such a hard time imagining some stranger coming to either my neighborhood where I live now in San Diego, which is a very large city, or even when I was a kid, you know, in my very small town up in Northern California, and just having that person become a part of our lives. It just seems like something that's very outside of my experience, you know?
Sure. You know, it's funny. I think about this from time to time as I'm getting older. You know, I'm 37 now, and I started the project when I was in my late 20s. You know, and when we met, you saw like I'm a pretty small framed guy. I'm not, you know, imposing in any way. And I often wonder how the dynamics shift in time. Like when I'm 55 and trying to do this in other places, will I be met with some sort of skepticism? You know, like, who is this older guy, you know, hanging out with my teenage kids, or, you know, just walking into my house and wanting to, you know, shoot the bull with me. It's always kind of been in the back of my mind, like, am I on some sort of time frame where it gets harder and harder to, you know, meander into strangers' lives without some sort of questioning of intentions or something, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's even a valid question, but it's something I think about, and sort of the dynamics of how responsive, you know, people can be to this mode of photographing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly something I've thought about a fair amount myself. Sort of how, I don't know, like, I don't know what it's like for you, but like for me, you know, I'm going to be 40 next year. So, it's something that's, you know, my age has been on my mind a little bit the last little bit, because on some level, you know, I remember my mom telling me this when I was growing up, how her mom would talk about, you know, you never really feel like you're older than 16 or 17 on the inside, but that doesn't mean that everybody else sees you that way.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's kind of going in the thread I was thinking of. I wonder about the social dynamics with age. And, you know, I think over the course of my experience with photography, and looking back, the personal work that I do is very much in this thread of finding communities and bedding down. You know, as far back as when I was in college, you know, I think the first project I did for like a photo essay was meeting this random Texas Gulf Coast shrimper. And next thing I know, I'm sleeping on his couch and going to work with him, and his wife's cooking us, you know, hamburger helper at night, and he's in his tidy whities in the recliner drinking a Zima mixed with box wine while we watch the Jeffersons on TV. And you know, and then from there, I went up and lived in a community for a couple months in northwestern Alaska with a native island community, and spent time on traveling with a traveling circus sideshow group around the South for a couple months. You know, and so I guess the point of me saying all this is it's the common thread of all my work and personal endeavors has generally been about sort of this immersive experience, you know, and, you know, finding that common ground with people outside my normal day-to-day experience. Right.
And it is, I mean, it's sort of a different paradigm, I suppose, than what we normally think of with documentary photography, or really documentary work at all. That, and certainly different from, say, photojournalism, where we tend to think of the documentarian as someone who is, or at times might be someone who sort of parachutes in, right? Mm-hmm. And not to say that that's necessarily even a way of working that is invalid, because like when I think about, for example, like the FSA photographs, right? Like those photographers were mostly not spending years of their lives in the same communities, right? They were
sure.
And yet we think of, people like, Dorothea Lange's work as being important for good reason. Mm-hmm. But that's also something that I think a lot about, right? About this sort of insider-outsider thing. It bears on my life a lot because, like I mentioned before, I've lived in San Diego now it'll be 14 years in January. Mm-hmm. And before that, I had lived, in a few different places in Southern California for college, but I grew up in Northern California. And, I don't know how obvious this is to somebody not from California, but the different parts of the state are not like harmonious exactly. Mm-hmm. So, it's on my mind often how, especially the more I become involved with my community here in San Diego, becoming sort of politically active, becoming, photographing here, things like that, how I feel like I've lived here a long time and I feel like I know a fair amount about the community that I live in. But I also, I'm always very aware of the fact that my experience of this place is very different from the people who have lived here their whole lives, or even, for example, like my kids who have lived here their whole lives,
Sure. I mean, I think for me in this particular body of work, that was the important thing to keep in mind, was that, in order to get a sort of a real look at what life is like, the nuances of casual daily life, it takes a sense of collaboration, right? It was very, very important to sort of maintain this sort of working together. And the photographs were really sort of a byproduct of whatever life was doing for those folks and myself at the time, right? Like, rarely would I set out to, to create things that generally would be found, and oftentimes at the suggestion of folks. So, I think, that collaboration, it helps in a way to bring forth an authenticity to the experience, right? Mm-hmm. And, would certainly like differ from my perspective if I just walked in and parachuted in, as you said, and sort of skimmed off the top and took what I had and ran with it.
Yeah.
And talking about the Who Belongs Where idea is, I had come across, this was later last year, I believe. I'd received a copy of Aperture's Vision and Justice issue. Have you seen that copy? It was guest curated by this woman, Sarah Lewis, and focused on the portrayal of Black America in photography. And I think in the foreword of Mrs. Lewis's issue, she had this awesome quote that I pulled up, and she said, "Art is often the way to cross the gulf that separates us. How we remain connected depends on the function of pictures, increasingly the way we process worlds unlike our own." Right? So I think a lot of the times with this particular work, or any work where you're diving into a region that is, you can't naturally claim to be your own, photography, acts as that bridge to understanding. Mm-hmm. And I like that. I like thinking about things like that. And I think that was the thing with this project that, had me for a good while really considering, the act of photographing, communities that weren't mine. Mm-hmm. Right. And the responsibility that's carried with that, the degree of honesty and transparency that must be present throughout the process. Yeah. So that there's not this sense of like ulterior motives or, surprise, I made a book about you and you may not like it. And it has been the sort of a project filled with pitfalls on that when you're speaking in this day and age about race and regional identity, and not being of that race. You know, there's a weight to that one, you know, has that duty of educating themselves and being as transparent as possible.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of people who I either have read or listened to or talked with personally, whether they're friends of mine or just people I've heard of, who have taken a lot of different sort of angles, I guess, at answering this question of like, who should tell what kinds of stories.
Sure.
I'm not, and I think most people, even the people who are often very critical, right? I think most people are not willing to say, like, for example, white people should never tell black stories, right? Or, you know, for somebody like me, like I'm Asian, I don't think very many people would say like Asian people should never try to tell like Latin stories. But, you know, it's clearly something that does come with a certain, as you say, responsibility. And the thing that you were talking about, right, about bridging the gap, that this is something that's been on my mind so much. And especially, you know, in the context of, obviously, we just had an election and things feel very like the gaps are very hard to cross. And I keep coming back to this idea that it's really art, you know, not necessarily just photography, but art in general, right? That like what ends up being, I think, underlies so many of the problems that we see realized in our politics right now have to do with a lack of people having empathy for one another, and especially people of privilege having a lack of understanding and empathy for people who have less.
Yeah.
And that art is really the best way to be able to build that kind of empathy and understanding. So that, I mean, that's something that's on my mind a lot as I look at these photographs and put them in sort of the context of the times that we're living in, you know? I mean, I think it's really important to ask that question, but yeah, I think it's more complicated, right?
Well, I mean, the whole subject of race is complicated. I get really disheartened from time to time when I find the ease at which, I guess, the general discussion on a national level dissolves it down to a very simple conversation of us and them, you know, like making this clear division between two camps of individuals. And that it's far more complicated than that, you know, just because there might be a Caucasian guy, you know, in the room with me doesn't mean that his experience matches my own, you know, nor are two African-American men going to have the same life, upbringing, experience, sense of loss, sense of love, or, you know, general life experience. You can have similarities, in whatever way that surface value, skin color affords an individual or a group of individuals, but on an individual level, we all come down to a unique set of experiences to define who we are, right? So, you know, blanketing the entire race subject in this, like, one group against the other, with no hope or no belief that two people can genuinely get to understand one another, I think is an enormous pitfall in ever creating some genuine sense of understanding one another. There was a Cornel West quote that I picked up earlier last year as well, and he was talking about empathy, like you were saying, and he said, empathy is not simply a matter of trying to imagine what others are going through, but having the courage to do something about it. In a way, empathy is predicated upon hope, right? And which, you know, like really touched me. I always believed that, you know, in terms of racism or what is racism essentially boiled down to? It's this like lack of understanding, right? And I think this sort of idea of having empathy and knowledge are the two best tools you can have to achieve a sense of understanding, right? Like, and people generally, particularly in this line of photography, or I guess maybe just in general in life, you can only really ever understand someone as much as they're willing to allow you to, right? So I think two people, regardless of race or economic background, could sit down theoretically and have a genuine, open conversation that makes both parties feel vulnerable. And through that vulnerability, we find the sort of sense of shared experience, right? And thus empathy. Yeah, I mean, and so I guess full circle back, the whole thing is a complicated mess that I think sometimes it's easy for folks to simplify it for the sake of having, a digestible dialogue, right? And this notion of like who can photograph what or where, or this sort of protectionism, I think has become really prominent in the past 5 years or so too, which sort of makes it uneasy for me because, like, where does that leave us as creators, right? In some sort of tribalistic quarantine, under I don't know what you would call it other than some sort of, creative tyranny in a way, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is that. And, certainly as someone who makes photographic work myself, and, photography being the kind of thing that the way that photography interacts with the world in the process of making a photograph interacts with the world differently from the process of making just about any other kind of art, whether it's visual or written or whatever. But, and I guess one of the things that I think about this whole thing is like, yes, on the one hand, I want to be able to make the work that means something to me, that feels urgent to me, that feels, sort of emotionally activated to me. Right. But on the other hand, like I always, and this is something that I sort of had to come to, over the course of my life, right? It wasn't something that I came to quickly, but just the idea that like I can make whatever work I want to make, but there are consequences, and there have to be consequences for whatever work I make. And so like, for me, it's always a question of like, what are the consequences of my work? What does my work do? And what do I want it to do? And if it does something that I don't want it to do, then what do I do about that? You know what I mean?
Certainly. And that's the responsibility, right? Is understanding the gravity of your efforts and being conscious of that throughout the creative process. Yeah.
I wonder too, like, one of the things about photography is like, I feel like photography is, or maybe not even photography, like a lot of times we talk in literature too about who the work is for, like, because on the one hand, I feel like when we're talking about bridging gaps, right, and the nature of your photographs, where you're photographing sort of daily life and intimacies and resilience and faith and things like that in this African American community, right? That the gap that needs to be bridged there, the people that need to understand are mostly not the people that live in that community, right? Because they already understand that's their life. And I think that there's an important function to that too. But then I also feel like the photographs themselves must also, like it's both, right? It's always both, right?
Yeah.
And that seems like an interesting thing to me.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned it in my talk in regards to, or response to a question I was given, how do the people in my photographs take to the photographs? And I remember it was a pretty like jolting, experience after, bringing prints to folks or mailing prints to folks. At the very beginning of the project, I began, I walked into this pastor's bedroom that I would stay with in Mount Bayou, and his photographs pinned up above the headboard of his bed, or a mother, Tiffany, that I stay with. She's got a collection of all the photographs I've taken of her children and her over the years. And, they smoke in the house, her and her man, and she would keep them stored, wrapped in tissue paper and a Ziploc bag, in like the dark corner of her closet so that, that they wouldn't tarnish in the tobacco smoke. And so there's a sense of like preciousness to it, right? And then like the ultimate thing was to bring this full commentary in the form of the book that was released back to the hands of folks, and to be able to watch like a grandmother sit with her grandchild and see the progression of that child's whole life, or the family over time. It was a pretty like sparking experience, one that I hadn't had in the past. I mean, most of my experience with photography and the people I photograph is through, they're getting delivered a newspaper and they might clip that out and put it away. But to have these sort of cherished prints or, an archive of a decade of their lives is pretty precious.
Yeah.
The folks in Mississippi that I mainly stay with, the Coffee family, several years, 2 or 3 years before I arrived, their home burned down, and they weren't able to save anything like family photo albums and things like that. So, in a way, this whole process has been a restocking of family memories to some degree. Which I think is a very, delicate and cherishing thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's interesting hearing you talk about that, like that. I mean, on the one hand, that obviously must be a wonderful validation to know that the work that you're making is valuable to the people you're making it with, but also that, it strikes me thinking about that, thinking about my own family photos and, because personally, right, like as a photographer, my sort of first body of work was documenting my own family, right? And and what I find is with that work that what I'm trying to do is have the photographs mean a certain thing, that when I, might put them on the wall in an exhibition, that people will be able to glean something about the emotional experience that I have with my own family, right?
Sure.
And I think mostly audiences do, but still there's always this thing where the photographs mean something a little bit different. Like when I, for example, show the photographs that have my own kids in them to my parents or my father-in-law or something, it means something a little bit different to them than it does to just some random passerby who might see it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, with this, it was like, the world didn't need another, photo story about the Delta, right? But in the end, the project and the result of these photographs has really, mainly been for these folks and myself, and if people outside that circle, appreciated it or found some value in it, then all the better. And particularly like with the Delta, there's a tendency for people that don't have a personal connection to the place to, sort of cast it off as the stigmatized land of impoverishment and, racial strife from years gone by, and, or the sort of tourist, experience of seeing the history of the blues music that originated there. And so, the greatest hopes I could have had was that this work in its intimate ways was able to, offer a more personal experience for someone that may not ever have the opportunity to experience the place. Right.
Yeah.
Which I guess all goes full circle back to this idea of collaboration and getting some sort of earnest and honest representation photographically.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, and all of those things, you know, it's interesting that you talking about the experience from others, you know, that can be, that can differ from, you know, the gallery setting as well. I was kind of thinking about that in my head as you were speaking, like, you know, the context and the placement of images in that setting versus the setting of, you know, someone on their couch with a book or flipping through, you know, an article on a website. I've always been intrigued by, you know, that experience and the difference between those things, and, you know, the difference between, you know, someone interpreting an image when it's in a museum setting versus, you know, versus a personal print on their wall.
Yeah.
I think that context too, externally can have a big influence on how people interpret the work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
But maybe I'm getting off on a random tangent there.
Well, I love tangents. That's what the show's all about. But we're about at the halfway point. So why don't we take a little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
That was super fast. Thanks.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Gosh, well, I think in our previously speaking about, you know, sort of the difference of our working worlds and having occupations that, you know, as you were saying, as an electrical engineer, can afford you the flexibility to do photography, that you don't have to rely upon for a source of income, which must be really freeing. You know, in contrast, I feel like I've been kind of quite the opposite. You know, I went into school with sort of this sort of open mind of what career opportunities were out there, but very limited in a way. You know, by trade, I work for newspapers and magazines, and I didn't realize, I think, until toward the end of college that I was slowly being introduced to the idea of being a small business owner, right? You know, as a newspaper guy, I started out in my hometown area in Southeast Texas working for a small daily newspaper. And I kind of I had this, in retrospect, for me and my trajectory, I felt like I had this sort of, you know, perfect combination for what I do now, and where, you know, by day, well, let's start it this way. Like when I was starting out in college, you know, I was taking black and white traditional photography class, on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and then working for a local newspaper on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and every other Sunday. And these were two opposite, you know, ways of using photography. One was sort of the more theoretical and historical, you know, process of printing black and white in the darkroom, and a more artful approach, while at the other, on the other half of the spectrum, I'm you know, having to adhere to very journalistic guidelines and finding stories and documenting them in a very specific way. And it was a boot camp of sorts for experience for someone young in their early 20s to, you know, kind of find their way in life through photojournalism, right? Like I could be at a kindergarten classroom at 8:30, and then a homicide scene at noon, and maybe a basketball game at 7:30, and wrap my day up in time to process my film and put it into the paper that night. And when I realized that this was sort of this was a career path, I ventured off to the university I ended up graduating from outside of Dallas, the University of North Texas, with a photojournalism degree, and had interned at the Dallas paper. And at that point in 2006, when I graduated, which was admittedly probably 2 years later than I should have, you know, that traditional model of going, you know, graduating and starting out a small paper or a mid-sized paper and then making your way to a large paper and, working there until you retire, hopefully with a Pulitzer and all kinds of awards under your belt. Like that model just didn't exist by the time, me and a whole cadre of folks were getting out of school and entering the workforce. So suddenly I found myself totally reliant upon, my creativity as a source of revenue, right? Which comes with this whole host of complexities in terms of, pushing yourself. If you're not working, no one else is working for you. Mm-hmm. And, I look back now and I think if I ever wanted to quit, I don't know what on earth I would be capable or qualified to do other than maybe be a politician and shaking hands and making people feel good. so I'm kind of limited here, but it's been a total blessing to be able to to actually earn a living with my photography, while at the same time being afforded, because of running my own business, the flexibility of being able to take time off to pursue, personal pursuits. Yeah. Right. Do you feel like that, having the sort of the reliable, quote unquote real job affords you that sort of the freedom to use photography in any manner you see fit?
Well, what I would say about that is, I think that there's a sort of similar, I've talked to a lot of different freelancers, working in a lot of different, sort of mediums, over the years now. And my perception is that the pressures that I feel are not that different, because I definitely feel I don't want to undersell the sort of value of having a certain financial stability in my life, and security, or even just something as simple as having health insurance through my job is something that I try to take a lot of opportunity to be grateful for.
Sure. Yeah. I had to get married for that.
Yeah. But at the same time, and certainly when it comes to artistic and creative freedom, like I am a photographer, I'm a writer, and I don't have to feel beholden to anyone. Like I can make the work that I want to make, and I am also very grateful for that. At the same time, what having the 9 to 5, and for me, it's not always a 9 to 5. Like sometimes, like today, it might be like 10 to 5. But, yeah. But on other days, it might be like 36 hours without leaving the office. So,
sure.
What it does is it means that I have this big chunk of my life that I'm not spending on the work that I want to be doing. And
sure.
So, but I think that's also very similar when you're like freelancing, right? If you're a photographer, you might be spending your sort of quote unquote working time doing photography. Although I'm also very aware of the fact that freelancers are not necessarily spending the majority of their time. Like you're also hustling and trying to get new gigs and, billing and stuff like that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the work that you're doing, even though it's in the same sort of medium that you would make your personal work in, is not necessarily the work that you would be doing if you didn't have to make money at it. So that's all. I mean, I think it's a very similar situation.
Yeah, when you put it that way, I guess it is. I mean, and that's, I always have this conversation with friends. I was actually having it last night. And in advertising my work and doing the hustle, as you say, having a website is great, obviously, but, it's managing what you're presenting, right? And knowing who the viewership is. Like, it's not always true that, my black and white square images of this particular subject matter or region speaks to, Shell Oil, So it's having these sort of separate identities online and balancing that, because you don't always want to, you want to be in a position where you're making work that's coherent with your long-term vision, right? And not so much, work that you just have to do. I mean, that's a freedom that might come in time as the clients get better and the type of work you do becomes more and more consistent. But that's always sort of been the road of the museum gallery people aren't interested in seeing my corporate portraits,
right.
And balancing those two identities, while at some point you hope that those things find some sort of confluence.
Yeah. I have heard, I've seen a number of different art directors, like on Twitter or whatever, talk about how the first thing that they look at when they look at a photographer's website is not their tear sheets, but it's their personal work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm teaching these workshops now in Maine and Santa Fe, and I'll be in San Diego in February for the same thing. But it's interviewing. We routinely do these like Skype calls during the class week with various editors that I work with, and in July in Santa Fe, that was exactly the thing that every editor I found was saying, that they go to photographers' Instagram feeds or directly to their personal select section on their websites. And, and that's where you really get a sense of who the photographer is as an individual on a personal level, what their interests are, what they're passionate about. And, ultimately you would hope that irregardless of subject matter, a savvy editor would be able to recognize a photographer's capability of handling, people for portraits, and the skill that goes into that could easily be translated from a variety of portraits, to meet whatever demand they have. You would hope that, aesthetically they wouldn't stop at, oh, this is a square black and white portrait. It's not going to work for my color portrait. I've got to put in tomorrow's paper, So you would hope a lot of the skill sets translate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that's certainly got to be true when, news editors, for example, are looking for a photojournalist, but also like even for, more commercial stuff, like, essentially the message that I've always heard is just that, they want that the art directors want to know who you are in order to know whether you'll be a good fit. Although on the other hand, I've also heard from a number of freelancers who will complain at times when art directors will say things like, I just want you to take the exact same picture that you took before, but like, couldn't you like have this, like, I remember hearing this other, freelance photographer that I listened to his podcast talking about an art director that once told him that, I really would love to use your photographs, and like this, I love this photograph of this woman, but she's wearing yellow. Do you think you'd be able to take a picture that's like that, but where she's wearing orange instead? So I don't know.
Well, and there's been a trend, I think, in the past, since like 2008, 9, where you'd start to see, the advertising world begin to embrace a more sort of quote unquote authentic, natural, projection with photography, right? Like, a lot of corporations now are looking for, not this heavily processed, 16 lights and 3 assistants, to create, an environmental portrait of their company. They're looking for oftentimes people that are coming from the photojournalism sector that provide a sort of a sense of authenticity to their working experience, which I find refreshing and far less complicated, personally for me. I've always sort of been timid, despite, I guess, having acceptable working knowledge of artificial lighting, that idea has always sort of complicated my workflow at times. So it's nice to see that there's opportunities there where my photojournalism toolbox is relevant to the sort of more lucrative corporate commercial sectors.
Yeah. I find too, another thing that I was thinking about when you were saying this is, like the work that supports your life isn't necessarily the personal work, when you're freelancing, right? But, so like I have for myself, I obviously, as we've said, I have a day job, but there was a period of time where I was also doing, I don't know if you would call it freelancing, but like I did, commercial work where like I might do like I had a family portrait business for a while, and I shot weddings for a while, and I actually really loved doing that work. What I found was that when you're doing that, you kind of have to be a little less precious about the images, and you have to sort of problem solve on the fly, and that did sort of affect. I don't know if it necessarily affected my vision so much, but it did sort of affect the sort of techniques that I might apply when I was making my personal work. Do you find that for yourself as well?
It was actually kind of the opposite in a way for me. It's a double-edged sword. It's in one respect, my personal work has, for the most part, been like 90% in film and a particular camera, a twin lens with a Mamiya C330, and that provides a completely different working method than my 35 digital that I use on a work basis. That's very fast and can get layered, or it's generally more functionable on the go. And what I've found is actually, when I began shooting medium format, that started bleeding into my work for hire compositionally, where I was getting used to having things sort of center weighted in that square all the time. And then suddenly over time, my rectangular 35 images were becoming more and more simple and center weighted. And it's something I have to fight against. Like right now, the New York Times has me shooting a bunch of imagery on refineries and the Gulf Coast, sort of landscapes and such. And having done this over the past 4 or 5 days now, I've been trying to implement like a more layered, a sort of F16, F11 approach to things instead of my typical trying to get to 2.8 instantly. And it comes off with a totally different aesthetic feel, which I like. I'm just starting to dabble with that and try new looks. But but on the other side, it's like I'll get calls about the person using the personal work as a reference point. Like the New Yorker called 2 or 3 weeks ago to do a portrait of a woman for a story on historically black colleges and universities, and they specifically cite this sort of 2 1/4 black and white portraits from the Mississippi Project as their art direction for the piece. And and the European publications like the Financial Times Weekend Magazine or things like that will generally call me specifically for that style of shooting as well. It might be color, it might be black and white, but they tend to gravitate toward hiring me because of sort of personal endeavors. Which I find interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the ways that the format influences how you compose, even when you're moving back and forth between formats. I think that's something that a lot of sort of amateurs and non-photographers have maybe not the deepest appreciation from, like how different it is to shoot in a square format versus a rectangular format. And for me, like, I actually find shooting square really, really hard.
Really?
Yeah. Because I feel like the square demands a very different way of looking at things than a rectangle does. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've found that where with the square, I'm far more intentional, right? I see something and and take it for what it's worth, but I single out that. It's much easier for me with that square to single out this one thing I'm interested in. And shooting the rectangle, it suddenly, that expanded canvas means I've got so many other variables to have to contend with to narrow down what I want the viewer to look at. And that goes into the whole debate of like, why use black and white photography for this particular project versus shooting, color in a more quote unquote, like true representation of life there. And yeah, I've always seen these cameras. I've never been like a big tech guy, but I've always seen cameras in films and such as just simply being screwdrivers and hammers and a tool belt, right? There's a certain tool that works for a specific task better than the other. And like I was running around several years ago for a good while photographing coon hunters, these raccoon hunters, and the idea of them hunting is actually a misnomer. It's this intricate, it's a contest built on this sort of intricate point scoring system where the points are valued based on the dog's ability to track and tree the raccoon and the handler's ability to decipher what the dog is doing in that process based off its bark and repetition. And so these are like nocturnal landscapes. It's treacherous, like running through woods at night and navigating creeks and tributaries and things. And I started out shooting in a digital format with the 35 and, high ISO and letting the shutter drag, or I even started at the very beginning, I was bringing out a tripod because it was so dark at night. And the only light that you have to work with is whatever, moonlight you have or the helmet lights that the hunters wear. And I found that I was like at the beginning with this tripod strapped to my back, I was getting caught in all this briar and brush, and I couldn't help but feel like I must have been one of those like Independence War revolutionary fighters with a musket on my back, getting caught in briar, and so I transferred into using a Holga with a lomography ring flash and just shooting 3200 Ilford film. And suddenly that freed me up. It was much more agile, and coincidentally, like that ring flash would create a very similar fall off or vignette as the hunter's lights would in the trees or upon the brush. So it worked out in that sense. But I guess back in a long-winded way of saying what I was saying is that, that these various tools or methodologies were for me like simply that, tools.
Yeah. And it is interesting, I think, like how, and this is another thing that I find sometimes, I don't know if it's amateurs or if it's, maybe certain kinds of I find that photographers can be very doctrinal at times. But just this idea of like that the tools you're using kind of influence the kinds of photographs that you're able to take, or just the way that you see things. I find that it does have quite a big difference. But I like the idea of being open to working in more than one way. That is something that I find, especially the sort of more gear-oriented photographer, can be a little bit, as I said, a little doctrinal. Sure.
Well, I guess I've always sort of held this belief that, excuse me if I get too sort of whimsical, but I guess as photographers, we sort of carry or bear the torch of one of mankind's most defining traits, right? It's storytelling. From the hand pigmented cave walls of France to using those same hands to now navigate these sort of interactive landscapes on iPads. Fundamentally, all we're trying to do, regardless of the technique, is translate an experience or tell a story. And, so I try not to let the tool, hinder me in how I go about delivering that message. But at the same time, it's, having a practical mindset to understand what tool is best going to translate that. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like I could have easily have become a wordsmith or a painter or something. And it just happened that photography was this passport given to me.
Yeah. I do find it sort of interesting to think about that. Like, I feel like people, like why people pick certain things, like, I mean, some people for whatever reason, either are or feel like they are only sort of good at one thing. And so they're able to just sort of hone in on that one thing, or maybe they just only want to do that one thing.
Sure.
But it is sort of I don't know, like what we sort of gravitate towards, as people who are making things. I find that to be an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, the choice is up to you, right? Whatever your end goal is a total like self prerogative. And I find it compelling when I see photographers per se beginning to use other mediums to expand their abilities, like incorporating audio or, utilizing video or seeing installations with projections and creating atmospheres for their photography. I think we live in this, like I had this editor once at the Dallas Morning News as I was getting ready to graduate tell me that, back like I was saying at the beginning of this segment about, sort of going into this field with no real sense of stability occupationally. The editor told me, he goes, Brandon, I know this must feel like you're in the most tumultuous time to be venturing off into photography, but at the same time, this is also a period where the avant-garde can really stake a claim and make a statement, right? Like at that time, the newspapers were laying off people and trying to reinvent themselves, and the advent of the internet opened all these possibilities for narrative building, interactive maps or embedding video. And it's always just felt like we're in the midst of a very exciting time being visual creators, right? Because we have such a diverse set of tools to tinker with.
Yeah. Well, so we're getting pretty close to time, but there's one question that I always like to end with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity of some sort that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
With us having just moved to Houston, we attended an art event at the Rothko Chapel next to the Menil Museum, which was built by the Menils to house Rothko's last set of paintings before his death. And there are these huge, larger than life black canvases with multiple tones of black. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be able to have this sort of meditative space. They use it as sort of this non-religious, religious place of meditating and relaxation, where you can just go and sit in front of these black canvases and contemplate whatever ails you or whatever's on your mind. And I think at this point in my life, having a space like that is becoming more and more valuable as just a place of momentary relaxation and reflection. Yeah, so I'm happy to be closer to that installation, and it's also awesome that I'm moving to Houston now. The photo community or the art community in Houston is this burgeoning thing that functions really well between places like the Houston Center of Photography or the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and to be able to have this newfound sense of community and creative dialogue, I feel like it's going to be a real breath of fresh air.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, so thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mike.
All All right, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, Brandon is giving a workshop in San Diego from February 28th through March 3rd called Turning Work into Work, Bringing Personal Vision to the Marketplace. There's a link in the show notes, so do check that out. And if you have any comments, feedback, thoughts about today's conversation, feel free to get in touch. Send an email to podcast@keepthechannelopen.com or tweet me at channelopenpod. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, as I mentioned, you can follow me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen, or you can send an email to podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. It also gets you access to our subscriber-only bonus content. You can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. And please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. That does help new listeners find the show. We're also now on YouTube if that's your preference, so you can like and subscribe there. Just search Keep the Channel Open. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on December 19th with a conversation with writer and podcaster David Naiman, so be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.